Good evening and welcome to the Massachusetts Historical Society. I am Catherine Allgore, president of the MHS. And tonight, well, it's a special occasion. And I welcome you here to a dynamic conversation. Our accomplished guests will explore the historic threads that link the Civil War and World War I to major conflicts that shaped the American experience and were fought only 50 years apart. This panel will consider the legacy of the Civil War and how both the Civil War and World War I influenced the modernization of the United States. Dr. Kanisorn Wongsrichanalai, our own director of research here at the Historical Society, and Dr. David Silbey of Cornell University have edited the new book under consideration, Wars, Civil and Great: The American Experience in the Civil War and World War I. They will lead the conversation. Joining them are our distinguished panelists, Dr. Brian Allen Drake, professor at the University of Georgia, and Dr. Kathleen Logathitis Thompson, renowned scholar of 19th century military history. I'm so pleased that this is happening tonight for many reasons, personal and professional. But I'm also very happy to say that I think this program exemplifies our work here at the MHS. We are dedicated to the inquiry into historic events. We question them and examine them with vigor and find the connective tissue of history to our present. And in this way, we hope, in our own small way, we contribute to a deeper understanding of the world and the human beings on it. So in that spirit, I welcome you and thank you for participating this evening. And we'll now turn the program over to Dr. Wongsrichanalai. Kid.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for those kind remarks. And thank you to all of you for joining us here this evening at 1154 Boylston and folks who are joining us online. It is a true honor to stand at this podium to discuss War, Civil and Great with my co-editor, as well as some of the fellow authors who are in this book today. I first came to the MHS as a graduate student, and although I never had an opportunity to present my monograph or the first edited volume, both of which were based on collections here at the MHS, I am thrilled to be able to share this one with you. In many ways, Wars, Civil and Great represents a turning point in my thinking as an historian. If you have been keeping track of MHS academic programming since I arrived, you may get a sense of what I mean. This is a project that attempts to get us to rethink how we define the periods of American history, how we frame its narrative arc. So, for example, World War I is often considered alongside World War II. They're products of the 20th century. Civil War is clearly a product of the 19th century. But what do we learn if we change this up a little bit and change our framing and periodization? From the very start, in 1791, the Massachusetts Historical Society has been more than just a repository of the building blocks of the American past. We have also been a community of historians who have talked not just about the details of what happened in history, but also about how we might look at the past and interpret it so that we get a better understanding of our humanity. And in that spirit, and in the spirit that animated this book, I, as director of research, have attempted to bring scholars together from various fields into conversation with each other. In 2020, our first Conrad E. Wright Research Conference brought scholars of African American history, of Reconstruction, of women's history together to talk about the theme of voting rights, since that was such a pivotal anniversary for both the 15th Amendment and the 19th Amendment. Next summer, in 2024, we are bringing together scholars of Native American history as well as immigration history to talk about citizenship in this important year. It's the 100th anniversary of both the Indian Citizenship Act and the Immigration Act that limited immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. So we're bringing these people together, these groups together that don't usually speak to each other. The idea of combining different periods and bringing scholars from different subdisciplines together provides new ways of looking at the past. It started with this book. So in many ways, this book was a great experiment. And like all experiments, foolish and great, and all academic endeavors, it began in a bar. Before coming to the MHS, I was an associate professor of history at Angelo State University in Texas. After we wrapped up a 4-year-long series to mark the 150th of the American Civil War, we started to look at the 100th anniversary of World War I. And our first guest speaker, thanks to generous support from the National Endowment for the Humanities, write your representatives, was David Silbey. And while David was on stage, he made some remarks about how the British commander, Sir Douglas Haig, had to face some of the same issues that Ulysses Grant faced during the American Civil War. After the talk, we went to a local establishment to toast this, and we also started to just list how these two conflicts, just 50 years apart, had so much in common. 50 years apart. We're celebrating 1973 right now. Folks can remember what happened. It's not that far. As David and I talked about these two conflicts, the connections became pretty clear. They stood out. The Civil War generation was very much alive when the Great War erupted in Europe. Several members of the United States Congress were veterans of the Civil War. On the United States Supreme Court, the Chief Justice, Edward White, and also Associate Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Boston's own, were on the highest bench in the land. So they were in positions of power. And those who had grown up during or in the shadow of the Civil War sought to apply the lessons they learned to the conflict of their own time. President Woodrow Wilson was a child during the short-lived years of the Confederacy. He remembered the conflict. Himself a student of history, he certainly looked to his illustrious predecessor, Abraham Lincoln, to talk about or to learn from that conflict and how to lead the nation through one of such scale. General John J. Pershing, the commander of the American Expeditionary Forces, remembered how his father was almost killed in a Confederate raid in his hometown in Missouri. Pershing himself was a toddler at the time. While he was a cadet at West Point, he attended the funeral of Ulysses Grant, and he must have been thinking of the great savior of the Union as he attempted to apply or replicate Grant's war of maneuver on the fields of Europe. Consider the parallels between the two conflicts, too. In both cases, a political system that had been established to balance competing interests began to crack and fail. In the United States, it was the compromise between the slave and the free states. In Europe, this was a balance of power between the major nations to keep the continent at peace. The slave and free compromise started to crack as westward expansion called into question how a flood of new states would enter the Union. 50 years later, Germany, the power at the center of Europe, became an expansionist rather than a status quo nation threatening this long peace. In both cases, expansion and ideological clashes brought on bloodshed. The secession of the lower South states sparked the American War. The assassination of the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary led to the resulting global conflict. But neither secession nor Franz Ferdinand's death necessarily led to the destructive nature, explained the destructive nature of the war that was to follow. Successful Confederate resistance in the first 2 years of the conflict prompted Lincoln to turn the war that was purely for restoring the Union into one that was also for the destruction of slavery. And with the institution at the heart of its Constitution, at the heart of its existence at stake, Confederates fought even harder and forced the United States military to pay in blood for every single inch of its advance. 50 years later, convinced that the dictates of the Schlieffen Plan meant that they would have to strike and incapacitate France in order to defeat Russia, The German leaders decided that they would violate Belgium's neutrality, and in so doing, bring the United Kingdom into the war, making the war even greater than it was. The aftermath of these conflicts also mirrored each other in different ways. The United States, for example, suffered serious losses in its military or its in wartime leadership. Lincoln is felled by an assassin's bullet. Woodrow Wilson, who's fighting very hard to get the League of Nations passed in the Senate, collapses and is off the political stage. Both conflicts also led to domestic reforms in the United States. The end of the Civil War brings the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. The end of World War I brings the 18th and the 19th. These are times of reform, and not just in the United States, also in Europe, in the United Kingdom, for example. This leads to, World War I does, the universal male suffrage. All across Europe, there's the collapse of imperial monarchies in Eastern and Central Europe. In both cases, the post-war attempt at rebuilding and reconstruction also rapidly failed, leading to the resurgence of the same issues in somewhat different forms. In the defeated South, a lost cause mythology came about, with the idea, the belief that Robert E. Lee's armies had been defeated only by superior military might. Over in Germany, meanwhile, they nursed the idea that their valiant military efforts had been betrayed on the home front. Well, there are myths that are created after these defeats in these societies. So, with these realizations, David and I assembled a group of scholars, and we asked them to address different issues comparing these two conflicts and answer 4 questions. What was the legacy of the American Civil War? How did the Great War generation, interpret those lessons from the Civil War? How did the Great War change the lessons from the Civil War? And how did both wars contribute to the modernization of the United States? I had the great pleasure of authoring 2 of the essays in the volume, one on civil rights and civil liberties, and one on veterans and what they faced when they came home. I think one of the most surprising discoveries for me came from writing that second essay on veterans. The Great War generation viewed the pension system, interpreted the pension system that came out of the Civil War as a huge mistake. Payments to Civil War veterans cost the nation huge amounts of money. It was the largest item in the federal budget every single year. By the 50th anniversary of the end of the war, it had cost $3 billion. That's more than the cost of the war itself. The federal government was paying out $200 million annually to veterans. The system, reformers claimed, was rife with corruption. So, when Wilson's government set up for the post-war world, they did not wish to saddle their future governments with this pension issue. So they cut the veterans off, they gave them a small sum, and then they set them up for the post-war world, the new jobs and whatnot. The doughboys, returning from Europe, meanwhile, had themselves internalized this idea that the pensions were bad, that the Civil War generation was mistaken in doing all this, and they agreed with their politicians for a while, only to discover that those on the home front had benefited enormously from the booming wartime economy. So they asked for a bonus, which Congress granted to be payable in 1945. Then the Great Depression came. And with the Great Depression, there came this call from the veterans to have these bonuses paid early. And many of you probably know what happened next. The bonus army veterans marched on Washington, D.C. They wanted these payments. President Hoover refused and asked the military to clear them. So you have this shameful moment of people in uniform chasing others who wore that same uniform out of public spaces in Washington, D.C. It destroyed Herbert Hoover. So Franklin Roosevelt, during the Second World War, his government sought to prevent the mistakes of the First World War generation. That's what they learned from World War I. They created the GI Bill, and they said, this is how we fix what Wilson's folks had done. Everyone says that you have to study history to learn from it. But what if you learn the wrong lessons from history? The case of the lack of pensions from World War I is an example of what a generation got wrong about the past. And when we tell people to learn from history, we should also caution them to learn the right lessons. And that's not always easy to figure out. And perhaps one of the ways to ask the right questions of the past and to learn the right lessons from history is to not find ourselves settled into a belief that there is a single narrative. There's only one way to tell the story. This work is an attempt to get us to question how we narrate our past and argues that changing up the narrative also allows us greater insights into the past. I truly hope we have been successful. David?
As Kid has noted, all the best decisions in life and all the worst decisions in life come in a bar after a few drinks. I fully feel that this was one of the best. I'd add one note to your comment about the pensions, which is one of the things that illustrates is how alive the Civil War has remained in America up to the current day. Civil War veterans in their 70s and 80s in the 1920s and 1930s were financially stable, financially valuable in a way that many folks during the Great Depression were not. And so they were often married off to young women of 19 or 20 because those young women, when they became widows, would continue to get a pension from the government. So the U.S. has been paying pensions connected to the Civil War well into the 21st century because of this. But it illustrates the way in which, and I think we can think of other ways, the Civil War is still alive and still part of the overall conversation. My part in this started because I noticed a smile, or I should say I noticed the lack of a smile. And one of the interesting things that if you look at the pictures of Ulysses S. Grant, you look at the paintings of Grant, he's never smiling. Now, that was sort of fascinating because if you read the biographies of Grant, if you read stories, he was actually a fairly cheerful man. He spent time with his family. He would bring his children with him on many of his postings. He had a sort of sly sense of humor, but he's never smiling. And that sort of fascinated me as I began to think about what I study, which is the great total wars of the 19th and 20th century, of the Civil War and of World War I and of World War II. It stuck with me. Grant never smiled. Now, I'll come back to that in a second because that sort of started me off. But when Kid and I started talking about this project in a bar, one of the things that really I thought was important was the way that this crossed the boundary between eras. We think of post-1898 United States history as the era when the U.S. marched out into the world, became a global power, took colonies for itself in the Philippines, in Puerto Rico, other places in the Caribbean, and began to become the superpower that we have ended up with today. And before that, the U.S. was a power, a growing country, a growing nation within the North American continent. It's interesting to note that before 1898, all American wars happened in North America. All right, the Barbary Pirates are now claiming time to rebut that comment, but it's mostly true. Post 1898, all the wars we have fought have been abroad, have been somewhere else. And so trying to compare the two, trying to bring the two together seemed to me a good way to cross over that era between the U.S. as a nation trying to build itself on the North American continent and a nation thrusting itself into world power. The other part of this that attracted me to this was that the scale of both wars is beyond anything that we have experience with now. The Civil War, approximately 700,000 Union and Confederates died in a total population of about 29 million. The equivalent today would be roughly 30 million people in a population of 330 million Americans in 2023. That's a scale beyond which anything we can understand. And World War I was worse, not for us, but for the Europeans. These are two wars beyond any scale that we can understand, and figuring out how societies and cultures understood and dealt with that seemed to me an incredibly valuable project to undertake. And so I thought, and this comes back to Grant's smile, was that Grant was in a position that almost no general in American history has been. In a war of the largest scale that we have ever experienced, Grant was the commander of the largest army facing the enemy's largest army at the center of gravity on the Eastern Front in that war, and he was the one who triumphed. Understanding how we remember him is part of understanding that history. And I think one of the things I thought about was that we never represent him as anything but that avatar of total war. That he is always and forever the commander, not Captain Sam of the Mexican-American War, not President Grant of later on. He is always General Grant of the Wilderness in 1864, of Petersburg, of all of the incredibly sanguinary battles of the last 2 years of the war. And someone who is that representative cannot be shown smiling. You can't show him cheerfully, because that undercuts the way you're trying to represent him. And I think, you think who else in the U.S. sort of is a comparative to this? There are 3 generals in American history who have the equivalent of 6-star rank. And I bet we remember 2 of them right away. Who are 2? Grant's one of them. I'm giving that one away right away. Who's Eisenhower's 5 stars? Nope, 5 stars. 5 stars. Washington is the second one. And Washington, interestingly, when they appointed him to the equivalent of 6-star, they retroactively made him senior to everybody else. Washington will always be the senior most officer in the American Army. Who's the third one? John J. Pershing of World War I. And one of the fascinating things that question leads me to is we remember the Civil War. We don't remember World War I, not nearly in the same way. And so one of the comparisons we're going on that I wanted to do was talk about a war and a commander who is on everybody's lips, who we talk about constantly, who we argue about their memorials and whether they should be shown or not. We argue about the place of the Civil War in American history. I was mentioning to a few folks at the beginning that when I went to Duke for my PhD, I was introduced to something new, the War of Northern Aggression. And I asked when that was, and strangely it coincided with the Civil War. but something that is still alive today, to a war that we have forgotten, I think, to a large degree. World War I is never remembered in the same way that the Civil War. And so I thought I would compare Grant and Pershing to see how they were represented and how they were remembered. And I actually cheated, because this was a book about American military experience and American military memory, but Pershing never occupied quite the same space in World War I that Grant did in the Civil War. He was never the commander of the main army fighting against the main enemy. He was always subsidiary to Marshal Foch of the French, or Douglas Haig of the British, in that in terms of commitment of their armies. And so I, much to kids' distress at times, brought in a British general to look at as well, Douglas Haig, who was the commander in 1918 of the largest force facing the Germans, and who had much of the same kind of experience that Grant did. He was the man at the center of the war for the British. And the fascinating thing was that they are represented and remembered in much the same way. You won't find a photo of Haig smiling. You won't find a painting of Haig looking cheerful. He was actually, in the way Grant was, a fairly chipper guy, sense of humor, but that is not the way you could represent him. And so one of the things that I discovered as you look at this comparison is that the generals in charge become the war themselves. That is, the wars are so overwhelming to the nations fighting them that the people, the populations have to remember them through a person. They have to remember them through an individual. That's how we remember things, through people. And so Grant became the avatar of the bloodiness and violence of the Civil War. Haig, too, for the British. Pershing, to a much lesser extent. This is how we remember them when we put up statues and memorials to them. They are the representatives of the wars that they waged. Even at the time, they were seen as those avatars. Lincoln was convinced that Grant was going to lose him the 1864 election because the war was going so badly in Virginia, so many casualties, so much blood. In the same way, Prime Minister Lloyd George of the British thought that Haig was going to lose him his prime ministership because of the deaths and destruction on the Western Front. When the war was over, when the wars ended, the remembrances of those generals paralleled the remembrances of the wars themselves. When the Civil War was seen as a bloody fight between brother against brother, when Reconstruction was seen as a moment, as a way to reconcile with each other, Grant became a butcher who had slaughtered his men, who had slaughtered the Confederates for no other good reason than to prevent the kind of reconciliation that America was now trying to reach for. Now, I know not everybody agreed with that. There's a famous moment at the 1913 Gettysburg anniversary where they decide that the remaining Confederate veterans and the remaining Union veterans are going to meet at the bloody angle, what's called the high water mark of the Confederacy, and shake hands. And we don't have a recollection of who first said it, but somebody on the Confederates side said, hey, how about we take that hill? And when it became clear that the Confederate veterans were not going to stop where they had stopped in 1863, The Union veterans rose to the occasion, and a quite physical riot broke out in which 70 and 80-year-old soldiers were beating each other with their canes. There's a famous photograph of them finally shaking hands, but that was sort of the leaders of this were like, "You will shake hands now, or there's no dessert, and then you go to bed." Sorry, I may be channeling my parental side of things. And it's how historians have remembered them. When as the Civil War changed in analysis, the picture that historians have drawn of Grant and of Haig have changed from them being incompetent butchers to them having some idea, and back and forth. And it has less to do with the actual history than the way in which the war itself is remembered. Grant and Haig became the Civil War and World War I in history, in memory, in memorialization. Haig's memorial is about 100 yards from the cenotaph, the memorial to the war itself in London, because they had to connect the two things together. It's about representation. It's about how we remember things. And one of the things I'll highlight as a way that we might think about it is when people have gone through this kind of generational experience, the memory of that infuses the population until that generation begins to pass away. When I was growing up, there were plenty of World War I veterans left alive. There were thousands, tens of thousands of World War II veterans left alive. And all of those folks have begun to pass. And now the question is, how do you choose when memory passes? How do you choose what the history you're going to tell is? How do you figure out how you're going to represent this as memorialization rather than memory? The afterword, I want to highlight one more thing as I finish up. The afterword was written by a gentleman by the name of Stephen Trout, Dr. Stephen Trout, and he looks very carefully not at how the public and historians had represented Grant and Haig, but how they themselves had done it. He used Grant's memoirs written as he was dying of throat cancer and had to save his family's financial future, trying to get this out so that he would earn his advance. And John J. Pershing, writing in the 1930s as the Bonus Army March was happening, and as the project that he had fought for, World War I, was beginning to fade from American memory, are both written at times when those men felt that their voice needed to be heard, that their memory needed to be heard. I'm not going to spoil it. You have to read the book. There'll be a quiz. But I want to highlight the way in which it's not just about how we represent them. It's about how they represent us. And finally, I do want to finish up by turning to a completely different war. When you go to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, you will see things left at certain panels, pictures, notes, memories. They're all from people who knew someone on the panel and are leaving a memory, a hat, an empty cigarette pack, something that represents that memory. And every day at the end, the National Park Service gathers up all of those remembrances and catalogs them and saves them in an archive in Virginia. And it struck me as I was thinking about this that this is the way that people create memorialization and remembrance anew. Every day, the Veterans Memorial starts blank, except for the names, and every day the people coming create a memorial that includes the memories they want to be part of. And so when I think about that, when I think about our book, I think about what we're doing, it's about understanding not just what actually happened, but how we remember it how we think about it, and how we memorialize it. Thank you very much.
Next to Kathleen.
All right. So thank you so much for coming out this evening. I'm coming to you all the way from West Virginia, at home, as you can tell. So my part in this book looks at the experiences of mental trauma in comparison between the Civil War and World War I, and as well as kind of the treatment of mental trauma during both of these wars. So how I got into this conversation with this book, as a PhD historian, my dissertation was looking at this topic of mental trauma in the Civil War. And I was looking primarily at Union soldiers, but kind of looking at how do you define mental trauma in a time period that does not have a definition or really an understanding like we do today of mental trauma? And then how is the military treating these soldiers? How are they treated medically? And that was what I was doing my dissertation on. So when David and Kid reached out to me about this book and this idea of taking what I am already researching and comparing that to World War I said, why not? Why not give it a try? And these were two very interesting wars to bridge on this topic, because when you think about the study or the experience of mental trauma in the context of warfare, most people automatically will go to World War I, because that is when you see the idea of shell shock come out for the first time, this kind of first defining of a psychological casualty in war. A lot of, if not most of previous histories on kind of the lead up to what we know now as PTSD start with World War I because of shell shock. And here I was looking at an earlier war in a time period when they didn't have a name for something like shell shock. So bridging the wars was very interesting in my chapter, because I was taking a war where this idea was at least legitimized by a term, shell shock, and comparing that to a time period where they didn't have that kind of definition. So I will give you kind of a brief comparison of treatment in both wars, but of course, as David said, you've got to read the book to know the whole story. But I'll just give you a little bit of an overview. So when you look at the Civil War, that conflict was happening at a time in the United States, but also kind of wider than that, where you see kind of the rise of scientific and kind of medical treatments, a switch from these older colonial treatments that you see, like the four humors and letting blood to cure everything. And that's switching into this more scientific method of trying to diagnose and treat ailments that, of course, will then progress far after the Civil War. Mental illness comes in the middle of this, in the sense that when you look at the antebellum period, 1830s, 1840s to the Civil War, this is the rise of the mental asylum in the United States. This idea that instead of being a condition that is usually connected to criminality or being put in jail like it was during the colonial period, instead you had these institutions where someone who was mentally ill could go in, be treated, and be cured. There was this very big kind of positive outlook when you look at the period before the Civil War, that anyone who had mental illness could be treated and cured and released back into society. So going into the Civil War, there was at least an idea of mental illness and treating mental illness, but you see this break where during the Civil War, most often there is not a connection between a soldier who might be exhibiting symptoms of what we would recognize as mental trauma and then the experiences that might be causing that trauma. There was this, instead, there was this focus on either kind of hereditary causation, so looking at family history, or moral and physical causation. So a lot of times you'll see someone being put into a asylum for a moral cause. Like I once saw someone who was put into asylum for reading too much. And as a PhD student, I was like, oh, I'm in trouble. But there was really not this idea that traumatic events in warfare were leading to these ailments in soldiers. There were some things like the idea of soldier's heart, which often gets kind of brought up during the Civil War, but that was often kind of connected to the rise of cardiac ailments, not necessarily mental trauma. So it's interesting because in a lot of ways, there weren't lessons taken from the Civil War in terms of mental trauma and treatment because it wasn't recognized in the same way. But in the time period between the two wars, there certainly was a progression of kind of the study of the nervous system, so more physical things, as well as this idea of trauma coming out in terms of like railway accidents or something like that. You start to see the idea of like hysteria coming up in the interwar period, and that largely being attached to women, of course. So when you get to World War I, the interesting thing is that you will see some similarities in how the casualties of World War I are treated. But there's, of course, a very, very big difference in the sense that this idea of a legitimate psychological casualty comes out of World War I. So before I talk about that one difference, I do want to just very quickly talk about the similarities between the two. And again, if you are able to read the book, you'll learn more about the details here. But I found it very interesting that two wars in very different contexts with very different ideas of medical treatment across the board, there was a very similar cycle that happened when it came to treating mental patients, where the presence of trauma comes out in soldiers, and initially it's not very well understood, and there's this kind of optimism for getting them cured, which then turns into pessimism later when most soldiers were not cured. But then in World War I, you see the same flip to kind of focusing on hereditary causes, moral causes, or physical causes that you saw in the Civil War. And also the same kind of cycle of you're in the middle of a war, and military expectations and manpower requirements are going to put restrictions on any sort of growth in treatments or treating these kind of soldiers because long story short, you need men on the front lines, and you need men who are going to be fighting instead of going behind the lines for treatment. So there were very similar ideas in terms of kind of this cycle of how treatment progressed throughout the war. But of course, the big difference, as I mentioned, is that there was more legitimacy in the Great War about this idea of a psychological conflict. And that comes down to this idea of shell shock. So interestingly enough, this term of shell shock comes out of doctors recognizing that there was a set of symptoms coming off of the front lines that were not connected to a typical physical wound, like a gunshot wound. It was initially called shell shock because one of the early theories was that it was because of the percussive shock waves from explosions of artillery shells. That very quickly went away, though, because you'd have people who were not on the front lines or not near artillery shelling that would come in with those same kinds of symptoms. And of course, the military and the medical departments would have to deal with that. So very quickly, the term shell shock was no longer used, but it's kind of the one thing that we always think of when it comes to World War I and mental trauma. So in the Great War, in World War I, there was a more systematic approach when you look at how, especially Britain and France, first off, treat these soldiers. They come up with a plan on how they're going to treat medical or mental patients and get them back on the front lines. when you look at the United States, we had the benefit, I guess you could call it, of coming into the war very late. And so you actually have United States officers and medical personnel who were going across to kind of look at how these allies are kind of treating these ailments. And the United States actually had a major plan on how to reduce the amount of mental patients going into World War I. And that had a lot to do with trying to weed out incoming soldiers who might be considered susceptible to breaking down in combat. So, of course, something that did not happen during the Civil War. Interestingly enough, as I wrap up here, even though World War I sees a very different approach to mental trauma compared to the Civil War, with kind of legitimizing it and treating it in a systematic way, there is still this kind of cycle where towards the end of the war, and even in the pension process, which of course was mentioned earlier, there's a delegitimization of that psychiatric patient. There's less and less of a legitimacy there, especially in the post-war where they don't want to pay pensions for everybody. So following World War I, there's not a lot of serious progress when it kind of comes to World War II or kind of that period after World War II until you get to Vietnam. So in a way, some of the lessons that are learned in both the Civil War and then World War I, they kind of get overshadowed after each conflict as other things kind of come to the foreground. And then it's really not until Vietnam and after Vietnam where you see this idea of PTSD and then in more modern wars, traumatic brain injury come out and really legitimize this type of casualty in our modern military. So, of course, I'm happy to ask any questions when we get to the Q&A section, but I'll wrap up my time so that Brian can go ahead and get started on his.
Well, greetings from lovely Athens, Georgia. First of all, let me thank everybody for coming today, and thank you for our organizers and all of that. I'm gonna begin by telling you I'm not a Civil War historian. Technically, I am an environmental historian, which sounds like a confession. Which it probably is. I am an environmental historian, and I know that most people in this audience probably know what that is, but just in case you don't, environmental history is essentially the study of how nature shapes human experience and vice versa. What nature does to us, and in return, what we do to nature. And a lot of things fall under that definition. We study a whole bunch in this field. I in particular, normally, in my day-to-day research, I'm a specialist in environmentalism. We talk about capitalism, we talk about industrialism, we talk about all kinds of stuff that affects the environment and vice versa. Yet environmental historians have been notorious for neglecting war until relatively recently, which is kind of unusual. In fact, I would say it probably wasn't until the 21st century that environmental historians discovered that war actually existed and that it might have actually had a pretty profound effect on the environment. And there's been some pretty good work on World War II, on the Cold War. There was not a lot of stuff, not a lot of written on the environment in the Civil War until relatively recently. And I guess one of the reasons on here, I'm proud to say that for at least for a brief moment, I was a part of that, in what can only be described as a shameless moment of self-promotion. I was the editor in 2015 of this book called The Blue, the Green, and the Gray, which was a kind of first effort at Civil War environmental history. It's has since been supplanted by a whole bunch of great work, it mirrors Civil War history more generally, as all of the talks have suggested, and as you probably already know that we have gone far beyond the battlefield in Civil War history. We spend a lot of time talking about things other than, in the words of my colleague Steve Berry, who watered Lee's horse on the third day at Gettysburg. When Kid and David came to me with this proposal to do a chapter for this book, I was pretty intrigued. I had half of it down. I felt like I was pretty solid in terms of the Civil War. I had a pretty deep interest in World War I, but it was really personal. Just for instance, when I was a kid, I was obsessed with aviation. I had read Gene Gurney's Flying Aces of World War I over and over again. During when I was an undergrad, I read William Marsh's Company K, which is a relatively unknown piece of fiction from World War I, which is kind of the American version of All Quiet on the Western Front. It was a profoundly important book for me. I was pretty keenly interested in it on a personal level, but as a scholar, I had some work to do, and I really thought this was going to be a great opportunity to pursue some of my interests. And I got thinking, what was I going to study? What was I going to look at? Because the interaction of nature and humans over time, even in the context of a narrow thing like war, is pretty big. I thought I could study how, for instance, mobilization in both wars affected the environment. In fact, if you don't know, my future Pulitzer Prize-winning book will be on how the war shaped the northern ecology someday. I thought maybe I could do a mobilization comparative. To some extent, it turns out that's already been done. Just a quick book recommendation: Richard Tucker's 2018 edited volume on the environmental histories of the First World War is a good place to go for some of those topics. But I finally landed on this idea that I had just heard in conversation, and I think you probably heard it as well. This idea that Petersburg, that the trenches at Petersburg were a kind of prologue to World War II. In fact, somebody once described it on a website as the first battle, World War I, the first battle of World War I. That somehow the trenches of Petersburg and the trenches of World War I were linked in some kind of way. And I had accepted that, and I never actually looked into it. And so I thought, well, this actually might be a kind of an interesting chapter in this book. How similar and how different was the environmental experience of fighting in those trenches? And so I went straight to the battlefields, contrary to the tendency of Civil War history, certainly to get away from the battlefields. But I went straight to the battlefields to see what I can find. And what I found, and I'm gonna caution that I don't think this is definitive, but what I have found is the comparison doesn't actually hold up, which in some ways maybe runs a little bit counter to some of the other chapters in this book. I found that while they were superficially similar, once you dug in, so to speak, pun intended, that you found some pretty profound differences. And if you look at the images, you'll see what I mean. If you look at the images of Petersburg, and this is the summer and the fall of 1864 and into 1865, kind of the last great campaign of the war, just after the Overland Campaign. If you look at the pictures, you can see it. I mean, it's exactly what you're imagining. You have zigzagging trench networks. You have defensive breastworks and things. You have bomb shelters. The visual stuff is in a lot of ways the same, which I think is the crux of why people kind of assume them to be the same. Sometimes the experience, at least superficially, was similar. You are living outside. I mean, one of our jokes in environmental history is that we've discovered that the Civil War was fought outside. And World War I as well. You are subjected to the elements. Trenches have a notorious tendency to fill up with water during the rain. The sun is beating down, so on and so forth. Your day-to-day experience in terms of fighting can often be similar. For instance, stick your head above the trench and you will very quickly discover the snipers. You spend a lot of time being bombarded by artillery in Petersburg, for instance. You're going to hit with mortars and all kinds of artillery in World War I. You become very, very keen to what the rounds sound like, what kind of rounds are being fired at you, and where they're going to hit, and that sort of thing. So there's a kind of hyper environmental vigilance. So in some ways, it's fairly similar, but the more you dig into it, I found it to be different. In essence, if I had to boil it down, the World War I trench experience environmentally is far worse, for a number of reasons. First of all, it's the environment itself. You always have to start with the environment. The soil is different in northern France and in Belgium than it was in Virginia. It's much lower, so it doesn't drain as well. It's colder. You put all that together, and you're going to spend a lot more time being cold, but you're also going to get mud. And if there's one thing that's synonymous with World War I trench experience, that, of course, is mud. I mean, people wrote poems about it, as you probably know. They're really powerful poems as well. They did paintings. I lots of examples again in the book, but the soil was different. The duration, of course, was much longer. The trench system is active for almost 4 years. Tactics and strategy behind each of them are different. And again, I'll leave the book for the details. But maybe finally, the technology, of course, was so different. 4 years of relentless modern industrial warfare created a kind of carnage landscape, a slimescape, as one scholar described it, that was, I think, maybe unique in warfare up at that time. I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, but the mud of the trenches is a horrible amalgamation of dirt, garbage, blood, guts, feces, and bodies, churned together constantly for months and even years at a time. It's horrific, and you live and you sometimes die in that environment. And that is, for as bad as they could be, I haven't come across yet, again, a Petersburg description, and there are plenty of descriptions of the misery of the dust and the misery of the heat and the misery of the cold and things like that. I've never come across anything that was quite that awful. There is, as far as I know, no poetry about the mud and the trenches of Petersburg, which I thought was interesting. And again, I have to leave the detail. I know we're running out of time as well, but for me, I think the comparison didn't hold up, and I think that's interesting. Certainly, I think it was not the expectation of the soldiers themselves. Many American soldiers in World War I, of course, expected, as we've already heard, they expected open warfare, fighting among the trees, as one soldier described it, in the kind of Pershing mold. That's not sometimes what they got, and so consequently, I think it took the shine off of their experience, and consequently, and so we don't hear about that. Yeah, and I think maybe that's why. Maybe just to finish up, what the lessons were for later. I know one of the questions of the book was, what were the lessons for modern America? And I'm going to be perfectly honest when I tell you I don't know. In this case, I did think about maybe Vietnam. When I think of later wars where environment was a really crucial part. I think of Vietnam. I think of that tropical heat. I think of tropical diseases. The Pacific in World War II might be a good example as well. Maybe the lesson at the very least is that the environment will always challenge you in ways that you don't expect. That every war is in fact a war in a way with nature, against nature. It's an environmental experience as well as a human experience. And maybe with that, I will leave it there because I know we are running out of time. But thank you.
So I know we are at time. David and I, of course, are here later, but if anyone has a very quick question, you still have a few seconds here for either Brian or for Kathleen, now would be the time. Anyone online?
Could I ask Kathleen about the differences among the major nations fighting in the First World War, how they dealt with the issue of what became known as psychiatric disabilities caused by combat?
I am trying to remember the details of each one. Hold on one second. Because I do remember, because it's been a little while since we did this. I'm trying to remember. I think it was France was a little bit more, I don't want to say negative because that's not the right word. But when you look at like comparison of Britain and France, I think France was a little bit more not as sympathetic towards it. So they had less of a treatment plan, although they did, of course, realize that was there. Britain had a little bit more of a cohesive plan on how to handle the treatment of these soldiers. And so they put this practice into place where they would take the soldier from the front line, and ideally they would have treatment centers kind of behind the lines. That idea that if you're close to the front lines, it's easier to get them back to the front lines instead of sending them far away to a hospital. So the first step was to get them to kind of this behind the lines treatment center where hopefully they could recover quickly and then go back to the front lines. And then if there were soldiers who did not bounce back very quickly, they could be sent to hospitals back on the home front to recover. Again, with the ideal expectation that they would be put back on the front lines once they recovered. But it was kind of that idea where recognizing that the environment of what was going on the front lines was likely causing these soldiers to break down, removing them from that, giving them time to rest, whether it's at kind of right behind the front lines or at home, and then put them back. So Britain had a bit more of a comprehensive plan. France was not as comprehensive about it. And then when the United States came in to do their studies, they really looked at the British model most and kind of modeled the United States plan off of the British plan. So they had a little bit more of a connection there.
Right. We're going to be conscious of time for folks online so they can go about their evenings. But thank you, everyone, for joining us for this discussion of War Simple and Great. We hope you'll come back for more cutting edge research from the Massachusetts Historical Society. Have a good night.